Welcome to Kara's Cures, where we explore the leading edge of wellness. I'm Kara Sundland. So does your child learn differently? Are you noticing some issues at school right now? My guest, child psychologist Dr. Laura Saunders from the Institute of Living in Hartford, is here to talk about what parents can do if your child seems to be having a difficult time learning in school. Hi, Dr. Laura.
Thanks for having me, Kara.
So this is about the time where, you know, kids aren't perfect, right? There's going to be some missing this or this, that, but some kids are really struggling and don't seem to be doing as well as maybe they could. You know, they're bright, but it's not translating. And you say maybe they actually need something called a 504 plan.
Yeah, so let's talk some basics here, because you know I always like to define things.
Yeah.
It's very easy for us as professionals to throw out terms and words and other things that people have no idea what they mean. So let's start with some basics, right? So a lot of people have heard the term 504 or 504 plan. But a 504 plan actually refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that's a civil rights law. That's the source of the 504 plans. And Section 504 prohibits discrimination by any program that gets federal money, including public schools. Now, colleges don't have to put together 504 plans, but they must still provide accommodations. So that's really important to know for parents dealing with a range of kids of a range of ages. Now, what is a 504 plan? It's a formal plan for schools to ensure that a child who has a disability identified under the law will get the accommodations and support they need in order to be successful. Now, that's an important phrase, because it can't just be, my child's had a bad week, I think they need a 504 plan. They need to have an identifiable disability, which generally requires a diagnosis of some sort. Now, you know, a child could have a broken leg and not really be able to be mobile. It doesn't even have to be mental health. They could have a broken leg and not be mobile, or maybe have to be home for a couple of weeks as part of that healing. So the 504 plan, so the diagnosis would be, you know, fractured femur or leg, whatever it would be. And that gets them some of the accommodations that they need. It also could be a mental health diagnosis. So it could be severe anxiety, major depressive disorder. I guess it could be trauma, could be any number of different things, could be pretty severe ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But remember, anyone just can't get a 504 plan. You need a diagnosable disability.
Right, and so you could get that. Let's talk about how you would get one if you go to your pediatrician or if your child's already seeing a counselor. And this is something that might help your child right now, but the difference between, say, a 504 and something more permanent like an IEP, which I know you're going to define that for us, but a 504 could be temporary. I mean, maybe they'll outgrow it, or maybe they need it right now because they're suffering with something. And there could be some real practical things like that could really make a difference for your child.
Yes. So yes, 504 plans, and you formulate this with your school support personnel. They are reviewed on a regular basis, right? It does not necessarily weekly, but it could be monthly or quarterly, depending upon what the issues are. And if at some point your child does not need those accommodations anymore, they take away the 504 plan. Now that's different than an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. Now, an IEP is part of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and an IEP says that they may receive educational service in a special or regular education setting. Now, the IEP is generally under the umbrella of special education. So it's a little bit more serious, it's a little bit more long lasting than a 504 plan, and it's absolutely monitored by school support staff.
Yeah, so let's talk about, let's say your child has ADHD, and you know, maybe you already know this or you just got an official diagnosis. Some of the accommodations, you may be thinking, oh, it's school, they're just not going to be able to do, you know, keep track of things, or it's going to be hard for them to focus. Some of the accommodations might be that their teacher reminds them to turn in their homework, or that they can sit distracting. So some of these things can be quite practical, but really, really help a child make it through the day and do better?
Yes. So there are a lot of different types of accommodations, and I certainly, we can't go over all of them, but I can give you some examples of accommodations. So if we're going based on the example of significant ADHD, so your child has a significant attentional disorder that affects their concentration, their ability to pay attention, and it affects often their organizational abilities. So, for a child with that diagnosis, it might be they have a specialized planner, or they get, additional reminders from teachers. Because what we're trying to do is promote success. We want our kids, all the kids, to be successful in school. If school is a positive experience, they're more likely to hunker down and do the work that they need to do to be successful. So preferential seating, right? If you have a child who has a hearing impairment, sitting in the front of the classroom or sitting at a certain angle to the teacher might be really, really important. Extended time on tests and or assignments. So my daughter recently took the SAT, and she knew of other kids who got extended time in the SAT. They weren't in the same sort of classroom situations or didn't have the same monitoring. So some people can get extended time on tests and assignments. Another accommodation might be reduced homework or classwork because they just can't handle the volume. At times, kids may need behavior management support. If they have some behavioral issues, that might be something that is part of their accommodation based on their behavioral issues or their disability.
Right. And just, people are going to say, well, how do I get one? So step one, if you think that you might need one of these, what do you do?
So step one is I would contact your school support personnel, right? School social worker, school psychologist, guidance counselor. You check with them, because if they're saying, no, your child is just fine in school, it's going to be a little bit hard to justify getting some accommodations or getting a 504 plan. So check with school support personnel. If they too verify that your child is struggling and they have a diagnosable condition, it could be a mental health condition, it could be a physical condition. Your child could have a seizure disorder, right? That's a diagnosable condition. From there, then they put together a meeting to decide on A, establishing what the diagnosis is, and B, coming up with accommodations, and then who at the school is responsible for monitoring those accommodations. It is always, and I cannot emphasize this enough, always, always, always in parents' best interest to stay on top of those accommodations and be the best and strongest advocate that they can.
Right. And some parents might be thinking like old school, oh, come on, they just have to adjust, or we don't want to baby them. But talk about if, let's say, one of the accommodations was less homework. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going easy, right? It could be that this child, instead of 40 problems, it's going to take them longer. So we're going to give them 20. We're not necessarily taking away the rigor. We're just making it so they can be successful. I think some parents might be feeling like, oh, I don't want to, the real world doesn't operate that way.
Well, so yes, that is actually a common belief. And what I say is that, well, the real world actually does operate that way, right? So if my child has a learning disability in, let's just say, numbers, then the real world is they're not going to go be an accountant, right? They need to have modifications so they find success in areas where they can be successful and feel a sense of competence and confidence. So the real world does accommodate, because if you have very specific issues or disabilities, you're not going to then go into a field where that disability will be a significant hindrance. And yes, I mean, when we talk about a disability, we're not talking about someone who's struggling for a week or two. I do worry about a lot of those kids who've had difficulty learning through Zoom or other video formats, and they may be missing gaps in their educational curriculum, and they might need some help and support to compensate for chunks that they missed last year. And again, a 504 plan is not permanent. It's a way to increase success and help you maybe catch up if that's your issue, or accommodations to support your child in doing the best that they can.
So a lot of kids are struggling with anxiety, and some of that is, part of going through your adolescent years, right, or your teenage years. You worry about things in school, you worry this. But if you actually are suffering from anxiety, an anxiety disorder right now, you might get a 504 plan, and parents might say, well, how would that help them? Maybe it's that they're going to get an anytime pass, or they're going to be able to go take a breather. I mean, there are some things that people might be saying, well, what else are you going to do? How would that help my child if it's a anxiety disorder that maybe is recent with everything that's been happening?
So great suggestions on those accommodations. So kids might need, they might need a special pass that they can physically remove themselves from a situation where they feel an anxiety attack or panic attack coming on. They can take some initiative, remove themselves, go to the nurse's office, or go to see, again, a guidance counselor, school support personnel, and do something to kind of moderate that anxiety attack. So this is not always about covering over things or just ignoring things. We want to empower kids to make decisions, better decisions to help themselves. So instead of having a child have an anxiety attack in a classroom where other kids might see, that might cause them a lot of shame and embarrassment, we're empowering them to take charge. So, and again, these might be time limited. It might be, we put in some accommodations, we look to evaluate them on a regular basis, and maybe in 3 months or 6 months, they don't need that accommodation anymore, and we can take it away and modify it.
Now, obviously, if you're going to a private school, they don't have to give you the 504, but many, in your experience, private schools here in Connecticut will do some version of accommodations. They just won't call it the 504 because they're not getting federal money, right?
They're not getting federal money, so therefore they are not mandated to adhere to it. But yes, it is my kind of personal and private experience that a lot of the private schools now understand that they're going to get kids with all sorts of abilities and possibly disabilities. And they are much more willing to provide additional support and make accommodations in a way that they weren't like 20 years ago. Private schools just wouldn't do it because they didn't have to. But it's been my experience that private schools are very accommodating because they want to support all students.
Yeah. I think, how do you talk to your kid about this? Because kids don't want to hear they have a disability, especially if it's, there's a lot of controversy of should we even call ADHD a disability? It's just a different way of thinking. Sometimes these kids are actually way brighter than the average. Or I read an article that maybe we should rename it and call it VAST for variable attention or something. But or if they're struggling with anxiety, they think, no, I don't want to be that kid. I don't want to be singled out. How do you navigate that so these accommodations are helping them, but they're not feeling like they're less than?
So in this context, we're using the word disability because that's kind of the legal requirement that we need. I would almost never use that kind of language with children. Because it is very disempowering. So I would really word it like, you have these strengths and you have these weaknesses or these areas that really need some help and support. So what we're doing is we're putting together a plan to boost the areas where you need additional help and support. I would not generally use the word disability with kids. I think it could be confusing. It has a lot of negative connotations, unfortunately, and we need it for the legalese or for the accommodations, but I would really use very different wording for children.
Right. So to sum it up, if you think you might need a 504, step one is talk to the guidance counselor or whoever administers those things. Your pediatrician can usually give you a diagnosis, and then you can go from there. There'll be some sort of a meeting. Do you recommend bringing a professional in to help with accommodations, or you think sometimes schools will already have some ideas and they're willing to do this?
I do think advocacy sort of pushes schools to provide the accommodations that are needed. If you can get an advocate, and sometimes an advocate might be another parent who's gone through the process, right? You don't necessarily need to hire someone. You can, you can bring in, if you have a mental health professional working with you, if you have, a parent or a friend who's done a ton of advocacy work for their child, you can bring that person in as a support. So it doesn't have to be that you hire someone, but it is often helpful to have someone that's supportive to you.
All right. So 504 IEPs, bottom line is that there's some help out there. You don't have to just sit there and watch your kids struggle. This is your bottom line is once they start to feel successful, then their confidence goes up, everything improves, and it really helps everybody.
This is really critical, and we're in very sort of interesting times. I think kids need a little bit more support now than usual. Let's get them the support that they need. Parents, be the best advocate that you can be, and we're going to hope for better times.
Thank you, Dr. Laura, for all the information, as always, to empower parents out there.
Take care, Kara.
You too. You can find Dr. Laura at Hartford Healthcare, and the website is hartfordhealthcare.org. She's at the Institute of Living. Thanks for watching CARES Cures, and you can join the CARES Cures Facebook group as well to get more wellness information or follow me on social media.